In a world where disenfranchisement and injustice stood for order, where the aristocracy floated in luxury and the common people drowned in poverty, a spark was born that could change everything. Imagine that you are on the threshold of the greatest social revolt in history, the Great French Revolution. Today we will plunge into an era when ordinary people were able to turn the world upside down, when questions about freedom, equality and fraternity were not just words, but became a reality. The Great French Revolution, which took place at the end of the 18th century, was one of the most significant and influential events in the history of the world. It overturned the feudal order that had been established for centuries and shaped the foundations of modern France and many other countries. In this article we will examine the causes, course, and consequences of the Great French Revolution. In 1787, France began an economic decline that gradually turned into a crisis. Production was falling, the French market was flooded with cheaper English goods, and crop failures and natural disasters were adding to the problem, leading to the death of crops and vineyards. In addition, France spent a great deal on unsuccessful wars in support for the American Revolution. Revenues were inadequate. By 1788, expenditures exceeded revenues by 20%, and the treasury borrowed money, the interest on which was unaffordable. The royal court and the nobility continued to live a life of luxury while the common people lost their jobs and starved, and the bourgeois, businessmen, paid ruinous trade duties. French society was divided into three estates. The first was the clergy, the second was the nobility, and the third was the commoners, peasants, laborers, bourgeois, and the poor. The first and second estates made up only 6% of the population and paid no taxes. The only way to increase revenue to the treasury was to deprive the first and second classes of their tax privileges. Against the background of this injustice, the ideas of the Enlightenment philosophers Charles Louis de Montesquieu, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and Voltaire became more and more popular. They argued that people of different classes were no different from each other, and therefore should have equal rights and freedoms. The authorities fought these ideas, which only added to their fame. In addition, many Frenchmen were inspired by the example of the North American states, which, based on Enlightenment ideas about the right of the people to resist tyranny, declared independence from England. King Louis XVI was not known for the determination and strength required of a ruler in such a difficult period, but even he realized that in order to save the economy, everyone had to pay taxes. February 22, 1787, Finance Minister Calonne convinced the king to convene a meeting of notables, the highest clergy and aristocracy, and proposed to them to introduce a universal land tax. Upon learning of the state of the treasury, the notables were horrified, accused Calonne of embezzlement, and demanded his resignation. They had no such authority, but Louis yielded. And since the elite refused to pay taxes, January 24, 1789, the king announced the convening of the General States, representatives of all estates from all provinces. They were to help him find a solution that would suit everyone. Unexpectedly for the government, this news greatly excited France. The General States had not convened for 175 years, and everyone was waiting for a global change. The impoverished nobles wanted to increase their influence, the peasants hoped to own land, and the bourgeoisie wanted equal rights with the nobility and access to public office. Each region prepared its own list of grievances for the assembly to consider. Hundreds of pamphlets and public appeals to deputies were published. Equality and civil liberties were talked about in the streets. What is the Third Estate? Everything. What has it been so far politically? Nothing. What does it demand? To become something. From the pamphlet On the Third Estate by Abbé Sieyès. The first meeting of the States General took place on May 5, 1789, in the hall of the Petit Amusement at Versailles. At the opening, the king warned the deputies against dangerous innovations. Only financial issues were put up for discussion, all other demands of the authorities left unattended. Despite the fact that there were twice as many deputies from the Third Estate as from the First and Second combined, each estate had only one vote. The representatives of the Third Estate demanded an individual vote, but the government refused them. This angered the liberal-minded deputies. On June 17th, by a majority vote, 490 against 90, they created the National Assembly, which would decide the fate of the country. On June 20th, the deputies came to the regular session, but the hall of the small fund was locked. The king ordered not to let anyone in under the pretext of repairs. Then the deputies occupied the royal hall to play ball and vowed not to disperse until the constitution was adopted. The king brought in the guards and ordered everyone to disperse, but the president of the assembly, Jean Bayou, replied, "No orders are given to the assembled nation." Against the guards' bare arms, liberal nobles led by the Marquis de Lafayette, fearing bloodshed, Louis XVI was forced to recognize the National Assembly legitimate. On July 9, 1789, it was renamed the Constituent Assembly. It was to draft a constitution and choose a new form of government. The king was not going to give up. On July 11th, he dismissed the Minister of Finance Necker, who supported the Third Estate. This angered everyone. Ordinary citizens saw him as an advocate, while the nobility realized that he was the only one who could stop the economic crisis. Paris was surrounded by royal troops. In the city crawled rumors of impending massacre. Participants of the Constituent Assembly decided to strike a preemptive strike. July 14, 1789, a crowd of Parisians seized the Bastille, a fortress prison for political prisoners. It is this date that is considered the beginning of the Great French Revolution. The Bastille was for the rebels a symbol of the hated autocracy. In addition, the revolutionaries hoped to find weapons there. This castle would later be razed to the ground. It is noteworthy that at the time of the storming there were only 7 prisoners, 4 counterfeiters, 2 insane and a murderer. A wave of uprisings under the motto freedom, equality, fraternity passed through all major cities. Everywhere overthrew the royal government and swore to the Constituent Assembly. After assessing the scale of the unrest, Louis withdrew his troops and returned Necker to his ministerial post. From that moment, the Constituent Assembly became the supreme authority in the country. At the beginning of August, serfdom was finally abolished, the feudal duties of the peasants were abolished, and the nobility and clergy were deprived of their privileges. The estates were abolished. Officials and priests were no longer appointed, but elected. All church property was nationalized. On August 26, 1789, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen was adopted. Freedom of person, speech, and belief was declared to be natural and belonging to everyone from birth. Henceforth all people were equal before the law. At first, the king refused to accept the declaration and other decrees, but was forced to do so by public pressure. And after the adoption of the Constitution on September 3, 1791, the king was left with only executive power, and that was severely limited. In fact, his functions were now reduced to signing the orders of the Legislative Assembly, created to replace the Constituent Assembly. The adoption of the Constitution ended absolutism in France. However, the Great French Bourgeois Revolution did not end there. At the beginning of the revolution, the most powerful political force was the Jacobin Club. Its members held meetings in the former monastery of St. Jacob, whence the name. The Jacobins represented the interests of the Third Estate and fervently supported the revolution. However, by the beginning of 1792, in the club began disagreements that led to a split. 2 factions were formed. The Girondists, relatively moderate liberals. They wanted to spread the revolution beyond France and grant human rights to all peoples. They represented the interests of intellectuals. They got their name from the department of Gironde, from where the first members of the party were elected. Prominent representatives are Pierre-Victorien Vergniaud, Jacques-Pierre Brisset, Montagnard's radical liberals. They represented the interests of the petty bourgeoisie, ordinary citizens, and the poor. They demanded the full democratization of society, up to and including the legal right to defend their interests with arms in their hands. Their name translates as people from above. At meetings they occupied the upper left ranks. Maximilien Robespierre, Georges-Jacques Danton, Jean-Paul Marat are the brightest representatives. After the split, the words Jacobin and Montagnard became synonyms. The third political force was the Club of Fellows, liberal monarchists who represented the interests of the nobility and the big bourgeoisie. They believed that the goals of the revolution had been achieved and it was time to end it. They owed their name to the place of the meeting, the former monastery of the Order of Fainéants. Prominent representatives, Jean Bayou, Honoré Mirabeau, Gilbert Lafayette. Each party had its own program and arguments in its favor, but on June 20, 1791, all plans were disrupted. The king tried to flee the country. At night, Louis XVI and his family disguised themselves as commoners and secretly left Paris, but a day later they were caught in the town of Varennes near the German border. On June 25, the royal family was brought back to Paris. For the country it was a shock. The king betrayed and abandoned his subjects. Revolutionary sentiment flared up with renewed vigor. The Montagnards demanded that the country be reorganized into a republic. July 17th, Danton held a rally on the Champ de Mars, where he collected signatures for the abdication of the king. The mayor of Paris, Bayeux, and the chief of the National Guard, Lafayette, arrived at the site with soldiers. They announced that the king had not fled, but had been attempted to be snatched away. However, the people did not want to disperse. The order was given to shoot. The guards killed 50 people. Several hundred were wounded. This was the first bloody conflict among the revolutionaries. The situation in France worried the neighboring powers. Austria and Prussia announced their intention to return power to Louis and threatened to invade. The Girondists took advantage of this. On April 20th, they persuaded the Legislative Assembly to declare war on Austria. Louis signed the declaration of war. He hoped that if successful, his authority would be restored. But the war was going badly for the French. The army was short of officers. Most of the nobility emigrated or defected to the enemy. Food and discipline were also problems. However, the French blamed the royal family for the military failures. The king's wife Marie Antoinette was a sister of the Austrian emperor and tried her best to speed up the invasion. On August 1st, the Austrian general, the Duke of Brunswick, published a manifesto threatening to raze Paris to the ground if Louis and his family were threatened. This news sent the Parisians into a frenzy. On August 10, 1792, the National Guards stormed the royal palace and imprisoned Louis and his family. From that day forward, France became a republic. The Legislative Assembly resigned and announced the convening of the National Convention, which was led by the Girondists. In December 1792, Louis was sentenced to death for malice against liberty, the nation, and crimes against humanity. On January 21, 1793, the king was beheaded on the guillotine. In the fall of the same year, the Queen was also executed. One of the first decrees of the National Convention was to reset the calendar to zero. The year 1789 was declared the first year of liberty. Weeks were replaced by decades, and new names for days and months were adopted. However, breaking with the past did not solve the problems of the present. The Holy Roman Empire, England, and Spain joined the war. France was surrounded by enemies and suffered defeat after defeat. There was still no money in the treasury. Jacobins and the troubles of the country blamed the ruling party. April 6, 1793 created the Committee of Public Salvation, headed by Danton, who promised to punish traitors, conspirators, and counter-revolutionaries. Popular revolutionary newspaper Friend of the People, which was published by the Jacobin Marat, called for the massacre of the Girondists. On May 31st, a crowd gathered under the walls of the convent to demand the extradition of the Girondist leader Vergniaud and his associates. July 2nd, they were put under house arrest, and on October 23rd, the entire party top executed on the guillotine. The era of terror had begun. Once in power, the Jacobins published a new republican constitution, which guaranteed the right to work, education, medical care, and social benefits. However, it had no time to come into force. Its adoption was postponed until after the war. In the meantime, the convent, which was now led by the Jacobins led by Robespierre, established a temporary revolutionary order. To strengthen the army, announced a general mobilization. All factories and businesses were placed at the disposal of the state. They set maximum prices for bread. To maintain them, grain was forcibly taken from peasants and distributed among bakeries. Only the state could trade products. Speculation was punishable by death. Rebellions broke out all over the country, to which the government responded with a wave of arrests and executions. Robespierre did his best to eliminate competitors. In the following years, Danton and Bayeux and other charismatic leaders were executed. Earlier, Marat had died at the hands of the noblewoman Charlotte Corday, stabbed to death in his own bathtub. On September 17, 1793, the law of the suspicious was passed. Now people could be arrested not only for real actions, but also for suspicion of counter-revolutionary activity. The questioning of witnesses and the right to a lawyer were abolished. People were executed without trial. Meanwhile, the long-awaited breakthrough came on the front. In the winter of 1794 the army was replenished with fresh troops, and by spring the French managed to clear the territory of the country from the interventionists. The situation stabilized, and Robespierre announced that a final wave of terror was needed, which would purge the convent of traitors. There were reasons to fear for their lives almost every deputy. A conspiracy arose. On July 27, 1794, the deputies indicted Robespierre, and the next day he was executed by guillotine along with 24 supporters. On July 29, 71 more people were executed after riots in Paris, the largest mass execution of the Great French Revolution. According to official figures for 1793 to 1794 alone, more than 17,000 people were convicted and executed. How many people died in riots and prisons is unknown. After the dispersal of the Jacobin Club, the terror waned. The Girondists came out of hiding and returned to the convent, and the renewed government declared a general amnesty. In August 1795, the deputies adopted a new constitution. Legislative power now passed to the legislative corps, the upper house of which was called the Council of Elders, and the lower, the Council of 500. Executive power was exercised by a directory of 5 men, elected by the Council of Elders on the proposal of the Council of 500. The government stopped interfering in the economy and abolished the maximum prices. This led to inflation. Foods became more expensive, the common people were rapidly becoming poor, and speculators skimmed the cream. In the provinces, bandits ran rampant. In remote areas of the country, Jacobins tried to organize rebellions against the new government, but they did not grow into a general uprising. The people were tired of revolutions. The very word revolutionary was banned. Meanwhile, things were getting better at the front. The army, under the command of a talented young general Napoleon Bonaparte, invaded the Italian possessions of the Habsburgs and forced the Austrian emperor to sign a peace. The war was over and Napoleon became a national hero. In 1797 to 1798, Napoleon won several more brilliant victories in Syria and Egypt. The other powers looked anxiously at the strengthening France and saved up their forces for a new war. The French were now opposed by Britain, Austria, Italy, Sweden, Russia, and Turkey. The country was again threatened with invasion. But the French hoped in Napoleon's military genius. In the fall of 1799, several members of the Directory decided to plot against their opponents and appealed to Napoleon for military support. The young general realized that his hour had come. November 10, 1799, he, accompanied by soldiers, appeared at a meeting of the Council of 500 and forced him to transfer power to 3 consuls, one of whom Bonaparte appointed himself. At this event, the Great French Revolution ended. The revolution equalized the rights of the estates and rid the French people of feudal vestiges. At the same time, the price at which this was achieved was monstrous. Rebellions, civil wars, and terror claimed the lives of hundreds of thousands of people. The events of 1789 to 1799 are still a warning to the whole world. Ideas about constitutional order, together with the slogan liberty, equality, fraternity, spread across Europe. Liberal circles emerged in many countries, where they discussed the prospects of limiting the power of monarchs and adopting a constitution. Some rulers, fearing to repeat the fate of Louis XVI, began to implement reforms in favor of the population, and for others it was an excuse to strengthen their power by repression. All subsequent political upheavals were based on the French experience. The successes and mistakes of the Jacobins were carefully studied by Lenin while planning the Great October Revolution. One of the most important achievements of the Great French Revolution was the adoption of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. It formed the basis of the legal systems of many countries of the world and serves as the basis for modern international law. Thank you for watching. If you liked this video, please subscribe to our channel, give us a like and turn on notifications so you don't miss new videos. Share your impressions of the video in the comments.